Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Bean Family Stories channel. This is where we bring you interesting, funny, and inspiring stories from Mr. Bean family every day. You will meet me, Mr. Bean's son, someone you may be familiar with and I hope you love, my dad with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely sister who always brings positive energy with stories close to life. Every day, one of us will share new stories, interesting journeys, and today it's my turn. I will take you on an exciting adventure, but also profound lessons about life. Today's story carries a simple but important message. Never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprises waiting for us. If you like our family dynamic, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave some interesting comments to let me know what you think. Now, let's dive into today's story and dive into the world of surprises. Let's get started. Julia Montgomery adjusted her worn backpack as she stood in front of the gleaming doors of Kennedy International Airport. She could feel the weight of the mission ahead, the unease building up in her stomach. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, not a hint of makeup on her face, her clothes intentionally modest. A faded gray sweater, old jeans, and scuffed sneakers. She had made sure to blend in, to look like just another traveler, not the wife of the founder and CEO of Skyline Airways, the very airline she was about to investigate. The voice recorder app on her phone was already running. She glanced at the screen. 3 new emails from disgruntled customers had arrived, all forwarded by her old colleagues at the Consumer Advocacy Bureau. The complaints all seemed to follow the same disturbing pattern. First-class tickets mysteriously downgraded, passengers with less than ideal appearances moved to the back of the plane, and the list went on. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was systemic. Julia had a hunch that something bigger was happening at Skyline, something that wasn't just a matter of poor customer service but something far more troubling. She stepped into the terminal, the sleek glass doors parting in front of her. The familiar sight of Skyline's signature blue and silver decor brought back memories of when the airline had started, humble, scrappy, but with a strong vision to make luxury travel accessible to everyone, regardless of their background. But as Julia took in the polished floors and the gleaming counters, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The grand vision her husband, Alexander Montgomery, had founded the airline on seemed lost in the glossy facade of corporate success. Her thoughts drifted back to their dinner just a few days ago. "Alex, have you noticed these complaints?" she had asked, sliding a folder filled with customer feedback across their dinner table. Her husband had barely looked up from his paperwork. "HR handles customer service, Jules. I trust my team." Julia had been frustrated. She knew this wasn't just a matter of mismanagement. It was a cultural issue. "Your team hasn't been on the ground floor in years," she had said, her journalist instincts prickling. Something has changed in the culture. But Alex had kissed her forehead and brushed it off, as if she were overreacting. "If it bothers you so much, why don't you look into it? You're still the best investigative mind I know." It had been a half-hearted suggestion, meant to placate her, not an actual call to action. But Julia knew better. She had once gone undercover for 6 months to expose corruption in the pharmaceutical industry, and when she heard a challenge, she accepted it, no matter the cost. She entered the bustling terminal, now fully slipping into character. The woman she had become, Alexander Jules Whitaker, her maiden name, was flying first class to Chicago with a ticket purchased with cash. No frequent flyer number. No digital footprint linking her to the Montgomery family. Just a woman on a journey. One that would reveal the secrets hidden behind the polished exterior of Skyline Airways. Julia watched as a frail, elderly woman struggled with her carry-on bag nearby. A Skyline employee walked past her, not even pausing to offer help. Without hesitation, Julia approached the woman and helped her lift the bag onto the scale. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, patting Julia's arm. "Not like the old days when they jumped to help you, is it?" "No, ma'am. It's not," Julia replied, glancing over at the same employee now eagerly assisting a well-dressed man in a tailored suit, offering him a wide, enthusiastic smile. It was a subtle but glaring contrast. one that Julia couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a case of rude employees. It was a deeper, systemic issue rooted in the company's culture. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, Julia activated the hidden recording device in her jacket pocket, preparing herself for the confrontation ahead. She had known for months that something was rotten at the heart of her husband's company, something that went against everything they had stood for when they first started Skyline. The concept of treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance, had once been the cornerstone of the airline. Now, it seemed that was nothing more than a distant memory. Julia watched as the line for first-class check-in moved steadily forward. A well-dressed couple with designer luggage was greeted with smiles and an offer of champagne, while an elderly gentleman in a simple sweater vest was treated with barely concealed impatience. Julia's chest tightened as she thought about Alex. When he had first launched Skyline Airways, he had been passionate about making air travel accessible and dignified for all. Dignity shouldn't be a luxury item, he had said at the investors' meeting. Every passenger deserves respect, regardless of the price of their ticket. But now, with Skyline's stock soaring and Alex spending more time in boardrooms than terminals, something fundamental had shifted. The vision had been replaced by a cold corporate reality. As the check-in attendant, Melissa, looked at Julia's ticket, her expression turned subtly skeptical. She gave Julia a once-over, her eyes narrowing slightly before she said, "You're in first class." Julia gave a slight nod, playing her part. "Yes, it's my first time," she said, adding just a touch of nervousness to her voice. She knew exactly what was coming next. Melissa's eyes lingered for a moment, the skepticism clear in her expression, before she turned away to consult with a colleague. Julia's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her backpack, but she kept her face neutral, playing the role of the nervous traveler who was out of her depth. She could feel her pulse quicken as the conversation behind the counter became a low murmur. The brief exchange between Melissa and the supervisor was just enough for Julia to catch a few key words, but not enough to make out the entire conversation. It didn't matter. She had already gathered the evidence she needed. As she stood there, waiting, Julia couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The culture she was witnessing here was the result of years of gradual, silent changes. A company that had once prided itself on offering a dignified experience for all had, over time, evolved into something that valued appearance and status over basic human respect. The thought of her husband, Alex, sitting at his desk in a luxurious office somewhere, completely unaware of what was happening at ground level, made her stomach churn. This wasn't the company he had built, and it was time someone brought the truth to light. Julia's musings were interrupted when the supervisor, a woman named Linda Peterson, approached the counter with an air of practiced professionalism. "Miss Whitaker," Linda said smoothly, her smile tight but polite, "I'm afraid there's been a slight issue with your booking." Julia tilted her head, adopting an expression of polite confusion. "What kind of issue?" she asked. "I confirmed everything yesterday." Linda's smile didn't waver, but there was a thin edge to her tone as she replied, "It appears there was an overbooking in first class. We'll need to reassign you to economy. It's our standard procedure to reassign based on loyalty status and, unfortunately, it doesn't appear that you're a frequent flyer with us." Julia's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment the true nature of Skyline's policy would be revealed. She kept her voice steady, though there was a slight tremor of frustration creeping in. "But I paid for first class," she protested, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Linda's smile tightened, though it was still polite. "Yes, and you'll receive a partial refund for the difference, of course. Perhaps next time, you might want to consider signing up for our loyalty program." As Linda spoke, Julia noticed Melissa, the check-in attendant, whispering to another colleague, Trevor, according to his name tag. Their conversation was low enough that Julia couldn't catch all the words, but she could clearly make out the tone and the way they looked at her. It was enough. Julia felt a wave of vindication wash over her, mixed with a sharp pang of disappointment. She had known this would happen. The systemic bias, the underlying policy that ranked passengers based on appearance and status was real. It wasn't just a few bad employees. It was the company's culture, codified into practice. Her suspicions were confirmed when Melissa leaned in and muttered just loud enough for Julia to hear. No entry for the poor. They should stick to budget airlines. The words hit Julia like a slap to the face, but she didn't flinch. She knew this was exactly the kind of thing she had been looking for, the kind of evidence that would finally bring the truth to light. The fact that Melissa had spoken so openly about it, with no shame or fear of reprimand, only highlighted the depth of the problem. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a few rogue employees. This was a company-wide issue. Julia took a steadying breath and addressed Linda once more, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with another representative, please." Linda's posture stiffened, the slightest flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she masked it with another practiced smile. "I assure you, Miss Whitaker, there's no one else who can assist you. This is standard procedure when we need to reassign seats." Julia stood her ground. "Perhaps if you were a Skyline Elite member, or a regular first-class passenger, we could make other arrangements," Linda added, her words dripping with a subtle condescension. The bias was so ingrained that it wasn't even being hidden anymore, it was being defended. Julia felt the anger rising inside her but kept her expression neutral. "I understand," she said, her voice taking on a slight tremor of disappointment. "It's just that I saved up for this experience. It was supposed to be special." For a split second, Julia caught a glimpse of something that almost looked like genuine sympathy flicker across Linda's face. But it was gone before it could register. Linda quickly replaced it with the same cold neutrality she had worn since the beginning of their interaction. "Perhaps next time," Linda said, her voice once again devoid of emotion. "Now, if you'd like to accept your new seating, I can issue the economy boarding pass." Julia took the boarding pass with reluctance, her fingers barely grazing Linda's hand. The atmosphere around her seemed to thicken, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just about her inconvenience. This was about something far bigger, something that affected every passenger who had ever flown with Skyline. As she turned away from the counter, Julia's mind raced. She needed more evidence. She needed to dig deeper. This wasn't just a one-off incident. It was systemic, and it was affecting the company's core values. The next steps were clear. She would keep documenting everything, every exchange, every interaction, until she had enough to expose the truth. The boarding area buzzed with activity, but Julia's mind was elsewhere. She could already see the broader implications of what she had uncovered. Skyline's reputation was built on the promise of dignity for all passengers, but somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. It was up to her to fix it, or at least bring it into the light. As Julia walked toward security, she noticed the elderly woman from earlier, the one she had helped with her carry-on, standing near the gate, watching the boarding process unfold. The woman caught her eye and gave a knowing look. "They did it to you too, didn't they?" she asked, her voice low but filled with understanding. Julia nodded, her gaze hardening with determination. "Oh, it's not just me," she said quietly. "It's happening to a lot of people, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." Julia sat in the cramped seat of economy class, her legs pressed against the metal frame of the seat in front of her. The flight to Chicago had already begun, and with it, the suffocating reality of what she was up against. The seatbelt sign had dimmed, and the plane was climbing steadily through the clouds. Yet Julia's mind was racing in a different direction altogether. She kept her head low, her eyes scanning the cabin, cataloging the differences between the hallowed first class she had been denied and the area she now found herself in. The contrast was striking. In first class, the seats were spacious, the fabric of the chairs plush and comforting. Champagne was poured in crystal flutes, and flight attendants moved gracefully, offering service with a smile that seemed genuine. But in economy, everything was crammed together. Rows of seats where passengers struggled to make themselves comfortable, the lighting harsh and unflattering. The flight attendants moved briskly, their smiles more mechanical than warm. Julia's stomach churned at the thought that all of this, the stark division between the cabins, was the result of policies that had been put in place by people like Caroline Winters, people who saw passengers as little more than numbers, categorized by how much money they were willing to spend. Julia had known the airline industry was often a study in contrasts, luxury for those who could afford it, and a stripped-down experience for those who couldn't. But what she had uncovered at Skyline went far beyond what she had expected. It wasn't just a matter of upgraded amenities for first-class passengers. It was a matter of dignity. And that, Julia realized, was what had been stripped away from so many of the people who flew with Skyline. The plane continued its ascent, the gentle hum of the engines doing little to calm her nerves. In her lap, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and read the message from her assistant. Found internal memo from Winters, project appearance matters implemented last year. Julia felt a tightness in her chest. This was the smoking gun she had been waiting for, the document that confirmed her worst suspicions. The memo was damning. It outlined how employees were instructed to allocate service based on perceived customer value, with the goal of increasing bonuses by prioritizing well-dressed passengers. It was a policy that openly encouraged discrimination, rewarding employees who treated customers differently based on their appearance. It was systemic. It was embedded in the company's very structure. Julia felt a sickening realization settle in her gut. This wasn't an accident. This was by design. The rules weren't just informal biases. They were formalized and incentivized. She quickly typed a response to her assistant. "Keep digging. I need more on this. We need to understand how far this policy goes." Her fingers hovered over the keys, uncertainty creeping in. The truth was undeniable now. Skyline wasn't just another company with a few bad apples. This was a company with a toxic culture, one that had grown over the years as profits soared, pushing aside the ideals that had originally fueled its creation. As she put her phone back in her pocket, Julia glanced to her left, where Margaret sat, the older woman she had helped earlier. Margaret was now fast asleep, her head resting against the window. Julia couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with her. Both of them had been relegated to the back of the plane, treated as if they didn't belong, simply because of how they appeared. Margaret had confided in her earlier that she had once flown first class every time she traveled. Back in the 80s, she had said, her late husband and she would travel in style, treated like royalty by the airline staff. But now it seemed those days were gone. "Things aren't like they used to be, are they?" Margaret had asked earlier, her voice tinged with both resignation and bitterness. Julia had agreed, though she hadn't said it out loud, that the changes had gone beyond what even Margaret could have imagined. But as the plane continued its journey, it became clear to Julia that her mission was far from over. She needed more than just one person's testimony. She needed a deeper understanding of how deeply ingrained this culture of discrimination had become. The flight attendants had just begun their rounds, moving toward the back of the plane with practiced efficiency. One of them, a woman named Heather, was approaching their row. Julia watched her for a moment, noting the way Heather's eyes flicked briefly over the passengers, as if assessing who deserved her attention. When she reached their row, Heather's gaze passed over Margaret and Julia with barely a flicker of recognition. She did, however, stop for a moment to take a seatbelt extension from the overhead compartment, her hands slow and deliberate as she made sure to serve the other passengers first, those sitting in the rows closest to the front. Julia felt a wave of frustration but kept her face impassive. She had already seen the pattern. First-class passengers were given everything, even if they didn't need it. Economy passengers, on the other hand, were made to feel like an inconvenience. Every small detail was a reinforcement of the underlying policy. First class, where everything was perfect and seamless. Economy, where passengers were left to fend for themselves. This wasn't just bad service. It was a systematic, cultural flaw that Julia was determined to expose. As Heather made her way down the aisle, the young man next to Margaret, Jason, leaned over and whispered, "You're really recording all this, aren't you?" His voice was low but laced with curiosity. Julia didn't look at him directly, but she could feel his eyes on her. "Are you with the FAA, or some kind of undercover reviewer?" he asked. Julia smiled tightly, keeping her answer vague. "Something like that," she said quietly, not wanting to risk drawing more attention to herself. It wasn't the first time someone had guessed she was working on something undercover. but she knew better than to give too much away. Jason nodded, his eyes flicking over to Heather as she continued her round, offering a brief and dismissive smile to the passengers in their row before she moved on. "Well," he said, leaning in a little closer, "you're not the only one noticing this." There was a strange mix of solidarity and resignation in his voice. Julia didn't respond, but she could feel the weight of his words. The feeling of isolation that came with being treated as if you didn't belong was something they all shared, no matter how different their circumstances might have been. And it was that very feeling that had driven her to take this investigation to the next level. The plane continued its journey toward Chicago, and Julia felt the weight of the task ahead. It wasn't just about one flight, one set of complaints, or one company. It was about a shift in society, one where the worth of a person was determined by the clothes they wore, the status they held, and the image they projected. And she would be damned if she didn't fight to expose it. As the flight continued, Julia's thoughts remained firmly fixed on the task ahead. She was no longer just a wife trying to uncover a few isolated incidents of poor service. She was becoming part of something far larger. The more she saw, the more she realized this was no longer just about exposing a few bad apples. It was about dismantling a system, a corporate culture that had taken root within Skyline Airways and, by extension, the entire industry. When Heather finally reached their row again, it was with a tray of drinks in hand. As she passed by Julia, she didn't even make eye contact. Julia felt the sting of being invisible, a feeling she was becoming all too familiar with. Heather stopped to serve the passengers ahead of them, carefully pouring drinks into glasses, offering them smiles that seemed to come effortlessly, as though it were second nature to treat these passengers with the utmost respect. When she reached Julia, the smile evaporated just as quickly, replaced with a strained neutrality. "What can I get you?" Heather asked curtly, almost as if it were an inconvenience to serve her. "Water, please," Julia replied softly, trying to maintain her composure. Heather's eyes flickered to the tray in her hand. "I've already poured this one," she said with a hint of irritation. "I'll see what I can do." Julia nodded, acknowledging the dismissive tone but not allowing herself to be thrown off track. She was gathering evidence, each interaction becoming another piece of the puzzle. As Heather moved on, she could feel Jason watching her, his eyes narrow with curiosity. But Julia didn't acknowledge him. The last thing she needed was for someone to start connecting the dots too soon. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching on, and Julia's mind turned over the implications of what she had already discovered. She had thought that exposing Skyline's discriminatory practices would be the hardest part, but now she realized it wasn't enough to just document the behavior. She needed to understand where it came from, how deeply it was woven into the fabric of the company, and what had made it so pervasive. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her assistant with a link to another internal document. Julia's pulse quickened as she read through the memo, her mind working through the contents. Project Appearance Matters was more than just a vague initiative, it was an operational protocol. The employees' bonuses were tied to how well they managed to create a visible divide between passengers based on their perceived value. The policy wasn't just encouraged, it was mandated. Julia knew she had to act quickly. This wasn't just about putting together a report for her husband, though that would come later. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this was a much larger issue that had to be exposed in a way that would force the airline and its leadership to confront the truth. But for now, she had to keep playing the part. She had to keep her head down and gather everything she could. Every email, every document, and every conversation was another small victory on the road to uncovering the truth. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Chicago. Julia's heart beat a little faster, not from the usual nervousness of landing, but because she knew what was coming. She was closer than ever to the confrontation she had been anticipating, and yet, part of her hesitated. She had worked so hard to get here, to gather the evidence, but now that it was within her grasp, she couldn't help but wonder what the fallout would be. Would her husband stand with her, or would he protect his company at all costs? Would their marriage survive this? The thought weighed heavily on her, but there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and it would come to light one way or another. The passengers around her began to stir, adjusting their seatbacks and preparing for landing. But Julia's mind was already ahead, running through the next steps. She would need to prepare herself for what came next, for the confrontation that would expose everything. Everything about the airline, about her husband, and about herself. When the plane touched down, the seatbelt sign flashed off, and passengers began to shuffle toward the aisles. Julia took a deep breath and stood, gathering her things slowly. Margaret, who had been awake for the last few minutes, smiled at her, offering a nod of silent understanding. She knew, just as Julia did, that this wasn't just about a bad flight or a small issue. It was a battle of values, of dignity, and of corporate greed. Julia walked toward the gate, her thoughts focused and sharp. The evidence she had gathered would be the beginning of something much bigger than she had originally planned. It wasn't just about showing her husband what had gone wrong. It was about showing the world how a company could lose its soul while chasing success. And as she passed through the gate, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The real work, revealing the truth, was still ahead. Julia woke up early the next morning, the glow of the sunrise seeping through the blinds of her hotel room. She had barely slept, her mind still racing from the events of the previous day. The notes, the recordings, the damning internal memos, everything was in place. It had all led her here, to a point of no return. As much as she had hoped for a simple solution, a quick fix to the problems at Skyline Airways, she knew that wasn't going to happen. The more she uncovered, the deeper the rot seemed to run. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Julia sat at the small desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out her laptop and began reviewing the evidence she had gathered. The project, Appearance Matters, was far more expansive than she had initially realized. It wasn't just about loyalty programs or vague customer satisfaction initiatives. The company had created a hierarchy, one that rewarded employees based on how well they could distinguish and separate passengers based on their wealth and status. It made her sick. The more she read through the documents, the more she saw the systematic approach to dividing people by their appearance. The loyalty points, the bonuses tied to customer service performance, all of it was designed to reinforce the divide between the haves and the have-nots. It was a policy that essentially treated certain passengers like second-class citizens, those who couldn't afford the high-end amenities, those who didn't fit the Skyline elite profile. She'd known that corporations were often profit-driven, but this was something else entirely. This was a company actively encouraging discrimination, rewarding employees who went out of their way to make sure those in first class received special treatment while others, the non-elite, were left to fend for themselves. Julia rubbed her eyes and sighed. She had to get this information into the right hands. But first, she needed more. She needed first-hand accounts from people who had experienced this firsthand, people who had suffered because of these policies. That was the next step, gathering testimonials, collecting real-life stories that could make the corporate culture's flaws undeniable. With her mind made up, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. It was time to visit Skyline Airways headquarters. The office was just a short drive away, and Julia knew it would be a challenge, one that would require all of her investigative skills. She wasn't just walking into a building. She was walking into the heart of the operation, where decisions were made and policies were set. As she arrived at the towering glass building, she couldn't help but feel a mix of apprehension and determination. The sleek design of the headquarters was a far cry from the aging terminal she had visited the day before. Inside, everything was polished and immaculate, with marble floors and glossy walls. It was exactly what she would expect from a company that had grown to this scale. The receptionist greeted her with a practiced smile as she approached the desk. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "I'm here to speak with someone about the company's customer service practices," Julia said, her voice steady, but her pulse quickened. "I have some concerns, and I think it's important we address them." The receptionist's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I'm afraid I can't just let anyone walk in and speak to someone," she said, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "But if you'd like, I can schedule an appointment." Julia smiled politely. "That's fine, but I'm hoping we can speak today, if possible. It's important." After a moment's hesitation, the receptionist nodded and picked up the phone. "Let me see if I can get someone to speak with you." Julia waited, her fingers tapping on the edge of the desk. She had expected this, the reluctance, the delay, but she was ready. She had learned long ago that when people didn't want to talk, that's when the real answers were hidden. It was a pattern she had seen countless times in her career as an investigative journalist. The stonewalling, the avoidance, it only made her more determined. As she waited, her thoughts drifted back to her husband, Alexander. She hadn't seen him much over the last few days, and even when they did talk, it felt like there was a growing distance between them. He had been too consumed with his latest acquisitions and expansions to really listen to her concerns. His focus was entirely on the future of Skyline Airways, on growing the brand, not on the employees and customers who were being left behind. Julia knew that, deep down, he was a good man. But in business, there were compromises, and somewhere along the way, he had compromised on the very principles that had originally made Skyline such a success. She just didn't know if he would be able to see that now. "Ms. Whitaker?" The receptionist's voice broke through her thoughts. "Someone will be able to speak with you now." Julia stood up, straightening her coat, and followed the receptionist down a sleek hallway. The offices were as impressive as the lobby. Glass walls, modern furniture, and the hum of quiet conversation filling the air. She was led to a conference room at the end of the hall, where a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp navy suit, stood waiting. "Ms. Whitaker," the woman said, offering her hand with a professional smile. "I'm Caroline Winters, Chief of Customer Experience. I understand you have some concerns you'd like to discuss." Julia took her hand, feeling the firm grip that matched the woman's cool demeanor. "Yes, I do," Julia replied. "It's about the treatment of passengers, specifically, the policies that seem to be in place regarding how passengers are judged based on their appearance and status." Caroline's smile remained, though there was a subtle tightening around her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you mean. We have a rigorous training program in place to ensure all passengers receive the best possible service, regardless of their background." Julia didn't flinch at the defensive response. She had anticipated this. "You don't say," she said, her voice steady. "Perhaps you can explain to me, then, why a recent internal memo outlines how your staff is being incentivized to prioritize passengers who fit certain profiles. That sounds like a policy that creates distinctions, not equality." Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her professional facade. "I'm not sure where you're getting this information, but it's not something we condone here." Julia opened her laptop and slid the printed copy of the memo across the table. "It's all here," she said quietly, "and I think you'll find that it's much more than just a misunderstanding." The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, the tension palpable. Caroline picked up the paper, her fingers brushing the edges as she scanned it. Julia's heart raced. She had just placed the proof right in front of her. Caroline's eyes flicked back and forth across the memo, her jaw tightening as she absorbed the information. Julia watched her closely, noting the way her fingers twitched slightly as she skimmed the page. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Julia felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Knowing this was the turning point, the moment everything could change. After what felt like an eternity, Caroline finally looked up, her professional mask firmly back in place. "This," she said carefully, her voice clipped, "is not how we operate. These are outdated documents. They're not an accurate representation of the current policies in place." Julia leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Then why was this memo sent out to all employees? Why are your staff still receiving bonuses tied to this system? You can't simply dismiss this as a mistake when the results are still evident in the way passengers are treated." Caroline's eyes shifted momentarily to the paper, but then she quickly met Julia's gaze again. "I can assure you that these practices are being reevaluated, and changes are in progress. But there's no need for alarm. I'm certain this matter can be handled internally without it becoming public." Julia suppressed a bitter laugh. "Handled internally?" she repeated. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. If it stays internal, nothing will change. And in the meantime, more passengers will continue to be treated as second-class citizens simply because of how they look or how much money they have. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Caroline's face had gone a shade paler, but she was trying her best to maintain control. Julia wasn't sure if Caroline believed in the policies she was defending or if she had simply become numb to the inequality she was enforcing. Either way, this conversation was going nowhere unless Julia pushed harder. I've spoken to passengers, Julia continued, who have been downgraded from first class because they didn't meet some imagined standard of appearance. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not just a few rogue employees. It's a culture, a policy that has taken root within Skyline. And it's hurting your passengers, your employees, and ultimately, the reputation of this airline. Caroline sat back in her chair, her fingers drumming on the surface of the table, clearly searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. I understand your concerns, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. But we are a business. We have to make tough decisions sometimes to ensure our profitability and the satisfaction of our core customer base. Julia raised an eyebrow, the skepticism in her expression clear. Profitability? She echoed. By alienating everyone who doesn't fit a certain profile? By making people feel less than human because they don't wear the right clothes or carry the right luggage? Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not about making people feel less than human, she said, her voice now carrying the first hint of defensiveness. It's about providing the best service to those who are willing to pay for it. Skyline has always prided itself on offering luxury to those who can afford it. The fact is, people who pay for first-class tickets expect more. They expect a level of service that goes beyond the basics. And what about the people who can't afford that luxury? Julia pressed. What about the customers who save up for a special experience and get treated like they don't belong simply because they don't wear designer clothes or travel with the latest gadgets? What message does that send? There was a long pause as Caroline looked away, her gaze briefly flicking to the window, as though searching for some way out of the uncomfortable situation. When she looked back at Julia, the air seemed to have shifted. For the first time, her demeanor was less about defending the company and more about managing damage control. I can see that you're passionate about this, she said, her voice softer now, though still firm. But I can assure you that changes are being made. We've already begun to reevaluate our customer service training, and there are new initiatives being developed to address these concerns. Julia wasn't convinced. Changes don't happen overnight, Caroline. And what's in place now? She motioned to the memo. That's not a mere mistake. It's a policy. It's a culture. And that's the problem. Caroline looked down at the memo again, then back up at Julia. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do believe Skyline is committed to doing better. Julia could feel the urgency building inside her. This wasn't about just having a conversation anymore. It wasn't about policy changes or corporate speak. This was about exposing the truth. The entire company was built on the ideals of equality, dignity, and respect for all passengers. But those ideals had been buried beneath the weight of profit margins and appearances. And that had to be revealed fully. Caroline, with all due respect, Julia said quietly, her voice low and deliberate. If you truly believe Skyline is committed to doing better, then you need to start by accepting responsibility for what's happening right now. You can't continue to sweep this under the rug, and you can't pretend that everything is fine while passengers are being treated like second-class citizens. The tension between them thickened, but Caroline remained silent, her face unreadable. Julia stood up slowly, closing her laptop with a soft snap. I'm not leaving here without making sure the public knows the truth. I'm not just going to let this slide. People deserve better. And if Skyline won't fix it, I'll make sure they know why. For a moment, Caroline just stared at her. The silence hung heavy, as if Caroline was weighing her next words carefully. Julia turned to leave, her resolve stronger than ever. She had done what she came here to do, now it was time to take the next step. As she stepped out of the conference room, Julia felt her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer just playing the part of an undercover journalist. She was becoming the face of a movement, one that would force Skyline to confront its deep-rooted flaws. And no matter what it cost her, she was determined to see it through. The morning after her meeting with Caroline Winters, Julia found herself pacing the hotel room. The confrontation hadn't gone as planned, but it had confirmed one thing. Caroline was only a small part of the problem. The real issue lay deeper in the very structure of Skyline Airways. Julia had already known that. But hearing Caroline's words, the way she tried to downplay the situation, only made it clearer. The corporate world often preferred silence, sweeping uncomfortable truths under the rug. But Julia wasn't about to let them get away with it. As she glanced at her phone, she noticed several missed calls from her assistant. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no time for hesitation now. She quickly dialed the number. Julia. Her assistant's voice crackled through the line. You're going to want to see this. The urgency in his tone made Julia's pulse quicken. What is it? I've been digging into the flight records from Skyline, he said, and I found something. You need to meet me now. She didn't hesitate. Where? Head to the conference room at the old Skyline hangar by the airfield. I'll have the documents ready for you. It's critical. Julia didn't ask questions. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out of the hotel. The hangar was a 20-minute drive, located on the outskirts of the city, away from the sleek, modern offices of Skyline's headquarters. The hangar was old, a relic from the airline's earlier years, back when it was just another struggling startup trying to make a name for itself. But now it stood as a testament to what Skyline had become. A company that had grown too large, too disconnected from its roots. As she drove, her thoughts swirled around what she had uncovered so far. The policies that had been put in place were bad enough, but now it seemed there were more layers to the story. She had suspected that the treatment of passengers wasn't just about individual actions. It was a company-wide agenda. But this was something else entirely. The hangar loomed ahead, its weathered exterior contrasting sharply with the polished, high-end image Skyline had carefully crafted over the years. Julia parked her car and hurried inside. The large, open space was empty except for a few scattered boxes and old equipment. In the back corner, her assistant, Eric, stood by a table covered in paperwork. His face was tense, his eyes scanning through the documents as if expecting someone to show up at any moment. You found something, Julia said as she approached. Eric didn't look up immediately. He handed her a stack of flight records, his fingers lingering on the top page. Look at these, he said, his voice steady but thick with frustration. These are the boarding logs for the last 6 months. I've cross-referenced them with the complaints we found earlier. Things don't add up. Julia flipped through the papers, each sheet revealing the same troubling pattern. First-class passengers, those with higher status, were treated with the utmost care. But the records also showed a disturbing trend. Certain passengers who seemed to be downgraded or treated poorly had one thing in common. They had all been tagged in the system as low priority, a status that was not based on ticket class but rather on personal information stored in their profiles. Information like clothing brand preferences, travel history, and even social media activity. What the hell is this? Julia muttered, her fingers gripping the papers harder. This isn't just about loyalty programs. This is profiling. Eric nodded. Exactly. They've been using a system to track passengers in ways you wouldn't believe. This isn't about customer service. It's about how much the airline can extract from them, based on their perceived value. Julia's mind raced as she processed the implications. Skyline wasn't just prioritizing passengers who paid for first class. They were actively manipulating their customer base based on superficial factors. This was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just an issue of poor service. This was a full-blown systematic breakdown of everything Skyline had once stood for. Where did you get this? Julia asked, her voice tight. I have contacts in the IT department, Eric replied. People who are starting to realize the depth of what's going on. The system was designed to track more than just loyalty points. It's creating categories based on things like appearance, past purchases, and even, he hesitated before continuing, personal relationships. If you look the part, you get treated better. If not, well, you don't. Julia stood frozen, the weight of it all sinking in. They're profiling people. They've created a system of second-class passengers based on nothing but perception. Eric nodded grimly. And these records are just the beginning. There's more to this. Much more. Julia's pulse quickened, and for a moment, she felt the enormity of what she was about to do. She was ready. She had to be. The world needed to know. She turned to Eric, her eyes determined. We need to take this to the press. Right now. Eric hesitated. Are you sure about this? If we go public with this, it's already too late to turn back, Julia interrupted. The system is broken, and if I don't do something about it, then what does that say about me? About us? About everything we've been fighting for? Eric nodded slowly, and for the first time, Julia saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. They were on the verge of something big, but she knew the real battle was still ahead. There would be pushback, threats, and attempts to bury the truth. But this was no longer just about her. It was about the hundreds, if not thousands, of passengers who had been discriminated against by a system they didn't even know existed. As they left the hangar and headed for the press office, Julia's mind raced through the next steps. She had the documents. She had the proof. Now all she had to do was make sure the world would see them. And once it was out there would be no turning back. As Julia and Eric drove toward the press office, the weight of what was about to unfold settled heavily on her shoulders. She had been in sticky situations before, investigations that threatened to expose corruption, mismanagement, and deceit. But this felt different. This was personal. Skyline Airways was more than just a company. It was her husband's legacy, and exposing it for what it truly was, a corporation that had lost sight of its core values, would ripple through every aspect of their lives. The press office was a quiet, nondescript building tucked away in a side street, far from the hustle and bustle of downtown. As they walked inside, Julia could already hear the low hum of activity. Journalists typing away at their desks, phones ringing, news feeds scrolling on the large television screens mounted on the walls. It was a place where information was gathered and, more often than not, the truth was uncovered. They were greeted by Samantha, a reporter Julia had worked with on a few smaller stories over the years. Samantha was sharp, resourceful, and had a reputation for getting to the bottom of things. Julia didn't hesitate as she handed over the stack of documents. I need this to go public, Julia said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. This isn't just about poor service. It's about systematic discrimination. This is happening at the highest levels of Skyline Airways. They're using a profiling system to decide which passengers deserve respect. Samantha's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. This is huge, Julia. Are you sure about this? Once we publish this, there's no going back. I don't care, Julia replied, her tone unwavering. It's time the public knows what's going on. People deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or what they wear. Samantha gave a nod, her expression turning serious. I'll get the team on this. We'll verify everything. Make sure we have solid facts before we publish. Julia sat down in a chair, her hands trembling slightly, but she kept her composure. This was what she had been working toward. The moment when everything came to light. The moment when people could see the truth about Skyline. About how a company that had once been founded on respect and equality had been corrupted by greed and appearances. The more she thought about it, the more it sickened her. Her husband, Alexander, had poured his heart into building this airline, and now it was a shadow of what it once was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw it was a message from Alexander. Her heart skipped a beat. Just saw the footage from the hangar. I don't understand, Jules. Why didn't you tell me? I'm coming to Chicago tonight. We need to talk. Julia's fingers tightened around the phone. Her stomach churned at the thought of facing him. How could she tell him the truth about what had become of his company? How could she explain that the very thing he had built, something that was supposed to be about fairness and dignity, had turned into a machine that perpetuated inequality? I'll deal with him later, she whispered to herself. Samantha looked up from the papers, a frown crossing her face. You okay? Julia nodded, pushing aside the unease. "I'll be fine. I have to be." It wasn't long before the press team had everything ready. Samantha briefed Julia on the next steps, explaining how they would fact-check the documents and prepare a statement. The story would go live within hours, and they would be ready for the backlash. Julia knew it would come. She knew there would be denials, spin, and attempts to discredit her. But she was prepared. She had the evidence. She had the truth. As the meeting wrapped up, Julia felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. She had spent years building a reputation as an investigative journalist, unafraid to go after the truth no matter where it led. But this was different. This wasn't just about exposing a corporation. It was about exposing her own husband's world. It felt like the very foundation of their lives was shifting beneath her feet. She left the press office with a renewed sense of purpose, but her mind was still heavy. What would happen when Alexander saw the story? Would he stand by her, or would this tear their family apart? She couldn't afford to worry about that now. The damage had already been done. The truth was out there, and there was no turning back. When Julia got back to her hotel room, she sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the city below. It was early evening, and the lights of the city twinkled like stars. But even as she tried to focus on the beauty outside, she couldn't shake the feeling of impending conflict. She had taken the first step to fix something broken, but now the fallout was inevitable. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Caroline Winters. Julia hesitated before answering. She had expected the call, but not this soon. "Julia." Caroline's voice was cold, almost brittle. "I understand you've taken the story to the press. I just wanted to warn you. If you follow through with this, there will be consequences. You're putting your entire family in danger. Do you really want to go down this road?" Julia stood up, her heart racing. "It's already too late, Caroline," she said firmly. "The truth is out there. You can't stop it now." Caroline's silence spoke volumes, and Julia knew this was only the beginning. Skyline would fight back, of course, but Julia had never been afraid of a fight. She had come this far. Now all she had to do was finish it. Julia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the message from Alexander, her fingers frozen over the phone screen. She had hoped to delay this conversation, maybe buy herself some time, but the story had already broken. It was too late to turn back now. Skyline's dirty secrets were out in the open, and there was no denying the impact it would have on her life, her marriage, and everything she had built. She took a deep breath and called him back, her heart pounding in her chest as the phone rang. Each second felt like an eternity. When he finally picked up, his voice was strained but calm. "Jules," he said, his tone guarded. "I saw the footage. What's going on? Why didn't you tell me?" Julia's mouth went dry. She hadn't known how to explain it to him. How could she? How could she tell the man she loved that the company he had built from the ground up had become a machine of exclusion, treating people differently based on how they looked or what they wore? Julia started, but her voice faltered. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "Alex, this is bigger than just a few complaints. It's a culture, a policy that's been ingrained in Skyline. I couldn't sit back and let it continue. I had to do something." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Julia could practically feel the weight of his silence. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "But why didn't you tell me, Jules? We're supposed to be a team. Why did you go behind my back?" Her chest tightened at the accusation, and for a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. She had hoped that by revealing the truth, things would get better. But now it felt like she had betrayed him. The man she had always trusted, the man she had built her life with, was on the other side of this divide, and she was beginning to see just how deep it ran. "Because you weren't listening, Alex," she said, the frustration creeping into her voice. "I brought this to you and you brushed it off. You said it was just a few complaints, but it's not. This is systemic. People are being treated like less than human, and you're too caught up in the business side of things to see it." There was another pause, longer this time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a tension Julia hadn't heard before. "So what now? You've gone public with this. And you're putting everything at risk. Our company, our future, everything we've worked for. Julia felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. I didn't want it to come to this, Alex. But you can't ignore what's happening anymore. The policies you've put in place are wrong. They go against everything you built Skyline to represent. There was a sharp edge to his voice now, the frustration and hurt mixing together. And what? You think you can fix this? By airing our dirty laundry for everyone to see? Do you know what this will do to us? To me? I know what it'll do, Julia said quietly, her heart aching. But this isn't about us anymore. It's about what's right. It's about people being treated with dignity, no matter who they are or what they can afford. The silence between them felt unbearable. Julia could sense his conflict, his loyalty to the company, to his vision, but also to her. The man she had once known, the one who had been so passionate about his ideals, was slowly being swallowed by the very machine he had created. I need you to come to Chicago, Alexander said finally, his voice strained. We need to talk about this face to face. Julia's stomach twisted. She had expected the call, but the weight of it hit her hard. She knew what this meant. The confrontation she had been dreading. The moment when everything would come to a head. She had no choice but to face him. But would he stand with her? Or would he defend the company that had compromised everything they had once believed in? Okay, Julia said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I'll be there tonight. She ended the call and stared at the phone in her hands. This wasn't just about an investigation anymore. It wasn't just about Skyline. It was about her marriage, her values, and the future they had built together. There was no going back now. As she packed her bag for the flight to Chicago, Julia's thoughts raced. The truth was out there, but it wasn't enough. She had to make sure it didn't get buried. She had to make sure that no matter what happened, the culture at Skyline changed. People had to know what was really going on, and if she had to burn everything down to make it happen, she would. The flight to Chicago was a blur for Julia. Her mind was racing as she sat on the plane, staring out the window, watching the clouds drift by below. She had rehearsed the conversation with Alexander 1,000 times in her head, but no amount of preparation could ease the knot of anxiety that tightened in her chest. She had no idea what to expect when she saw him. Would he be angry? Would he understand why she had done what she did? Or would this be the breaking point, the moment everything they had built together fell apart? As the plane descended into Chicago, Julia felt a sense of finality settle over her. She had reached the point of no return. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The world knew what Skyline had become, and now it was up to her and Alexander to decide what came next. When the plane touched down, Julia grabbed her bag and made her way through the terminal. She could feel the weight of her decision in every step she took, but there was no turning back. She had already made the call. She had already exposed the truth. By the time she arrived at the hotel where Alexander was staying, the evening had settled in. The city outside was alive with lights, but Julia felt like she was walking in a fog, her thoughts clouded with the uncertainty of the moment. She checked in and made her way up to the suite, where Alexander was waiting. The door to the suite opened before she had a chance to knock. Alexander stood there, his face tense, his eyes searching hers for some sign of explanation. He hadn't changed since their last conversation. Still the same sharp businessman, dressed in a suit. But there was something different now. There was a wariness in his eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before. Jules, he said softly, his voice betraying a mix of exhaustion and something darker. Hurt, maybe. I'm glad you're here. We need to talk. Julia nodded, stepping inside the suite. The door closed behind her, and she could feel the space between them growing even wider. It wasn't just physical distance. It was emotional. This was no longer just about business. This was about everything they had built and everything that was now at risk. Alexander motioned toward the sitting area, where he had clearly been waiting for her. He had papers spread out in front of him, likely reports from the media fallout. The entire room felt charged with tension. Sit down, he said, his voice more forceful now. Julia took a seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how to begin, but she knew this wasn't going to be easy. She took a deep breath and started. "Alex, I know this is hard," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But what I did, it was necessary. The truth about Skyline, it had to come out. People are being treated unfairly, based on nothing more than how they look or what they can afford. It's not just a few isolated incidents, Alex. It's a systemic problem, and I couldn't sit back and let it continue." He shook his head, looking at her with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "I started this company with a vision, to treat people with dignity, no matter their background. But you're acting like I'm the one who caused this, like I'm the one who let it happen." He stood up, pacing the room, his voice rising with each step. Julia stood up, too, the weight of his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. "You don't see it, do you?" she said, her voice soft but insistent. "You're so focused on the future of the company, the bottom line, that you've lost sight of what you built it on. What we built it on. The culture at Skyline has changed, and you've allowed it to happen. I know you didn't mean for it to get this bad, but it has, and now it's on us to fix it." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes were filled with frustration, but there was something else there too. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice strained. "I didn't know. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I trusted the people around me, and they let this happen." Julia's heart ached as she watched him. This was the man she had married, the man who had once been so passionate about his vision for Skyline. And now, he was standing here, a broken version of that person, grappling with the realization that his company had become something he never intended. "It's not too late to fix it," Julia said, her voice calm but firm. "But we have to act now. We can't keep pretending like everything is fine, like the system you've built is just some business decision. It's hurting people. It's hurting the very people you once wanted to help." There was a long pause as Alexander looked at her, his face softening slightly. He ran a hand through his hair, as if trying to process everything she had said. "What do you want me to do, Jules?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "What do you think can be fixed at this point?" Julia stepped closer to him, her heart heavy but resolute. "We start by acknowledging the problem. We end the policies that allow discrimination to thrive in the company. We give people the dignity they deserve, no matter who they are. And we go public with everything. No more hiding, no more pretending." Alexander looked at her, and for a moment, Julia wasn't sure if he was going to agree or walk away. The silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay," he said, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. "Okay, we'll fix it. We'll make it right." Julia felt a rush of relief, but she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The company, the board, and even the employees would resist. But this was the first step. Alexander had finally come around, and together they could make the change happen. The press conference was set for the following morning, and Julia was already feeling the weight of what was to come. She had never been one to shy away from the spotlight, but this felt different. This wasn't just an investigative story or an exposé. This was her life, her marriage, and the company that had once been a beacon of hope for passengers now embroiled in a scandal that threatened to tear everything apart. As she stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the collar of her jacket, Julia couldn't help but feel the gravity of her situation. She had fought for the truth, but now that it was out there was no going back. Her phone buzzed on the bed, and she glanced down, seeing a message from Eric. "Everything's set for the press conference. Be ready. They'll be expecting answers." She exhaled slowly and sent a quick reply. "I'm ready." She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she had to be. There were too many people depending on this moment. Too many passengers whose voices had been silenced by Skyline's corporate greed. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about restoring dignity for the passengers and for the company that had once represented so much more. As Julia arrived at the conference hall, she could feel the buzz of anticipation in the air. The room was filled with journalists, cameras, and the hum of quiet conversations as everyone prepared for what was expected to be the most explosive press conference of the year. Skyline had been rocked by the scandal, and now they would have to answer for it. But no one knew exactly what Julia had planned. She was ushered to the stage, and as she took her seat, she felt the eyes of the room turn to her. The weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders. It wasn't just about revealing information anymore. It was about showing the world that change was possible, that even a corporation as large and powerful as Skyline could be held accountable for its actions. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked out over the sea of reporters. But when she spotted Caroline Winters sitting at the front, her stern expression unmistakable, Julia's nerves settled into a new kind of determination. Caroline was part of the reason they were here, part of the reason this culture of discrimination had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Julia wasn't just going to expose Skyline's wrongdoings. She was going to make sure Caroline and everyone else in the company felt the consequences of their actions. As the moderator signaled the start of the conference, Julia straightened in her chair, prepared to face the storm that was coming. The first question came quickly, a journalist eager to know how Julia felt about the backlash from Skyline's executives and board members. Julia took a deep breath before responding. I knew that coming forward with the truth would have consequences. But these aren't just my consequences to bear. This is about the people who were treated unjustly, the passengers who were downgraded, ignored, and made to feel like they didn't belong. The system at Skyline allowed this to happen, and now we all have to reckon with the fallout. A reporter raised his hand. But many are asking, why expose all of this now? Why not address the issue privately within the company instead of going public and risking your own family's legacy? Julia glanced at the moderator, then back at the crowd. I tried to address it privately. I tried to speak to the people at the top. But when my husband, Alexander Montgomery, who founded this company on the principles of dignity and respect, didn't listen, I had no other choice but to expose the truth. This wasn't about personal gain. This was about doing what was right. If I didn't do something, if I didn't bring these issues to light, who would? The room was silent for a moment before another journalist spoke up, pushing further. You've been accused of damaging your family's reputation by taking this matter to the press. How do you respond to that? Julia's jaw tightened. This was the moment where everything could go south. The moment where they would try to make it about her family, about her loyalty to her husband, rather than the systemic issue at hand. But she wasn't backing down. I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself, bigger than any family name, she said, her voice steady. I believe in dignity for all. No one should be judged by their appearance, their income, or their status. That's the core of who I am, and that's why I had to make this public. The truth had to be heard. The questions came one after another, each one probing deeper into Skyline's practices and Julia's personal motivations. But she was ready. She had the facts. She had the recordings, the documents, the testimonies from passengers who had been wronged by the airline. She had more than enough to keep the pressure on, to make sure Skyline couldn't just brush this under the rug. But as the questions slowed, Julia could feel the shift in the room. There was a certain weight to her words now, a certain recognition that the story was no longer just about a scandal. It was about a cultural awakening. People were starting to see what had been hidden in plain sight for so long. She could feel the shift, too. Something was changing in her. The anger that had driven her earlier had started to settle into a quiet, unshakable resolve. She had come this far, and there was no going back. This was about more than her marriage. This was about everything she believed in. As the conference wrapped up, Julia stood, the weight of the moment still pressing on her. She knew the fight wasn't over. She knew there would be more hurdles, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally on the right side of history. The aftermath of the press conference was swift. Julia returned to her hotel, her body exhausted but her mind alive with the sharp intensity of everything that had just unfolded. The press had picked up on every word, every statement she made about the corporate culture that had festered at Skyline. There was no going back now. The story was everywhere. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages. Texts from her assistant, reporters asking for follow-ups, and, of course, the one text that made her stomach churn. "We need to talk. Now." It was from Alexander. She hadn't expected him to reach out so quickly. But then again, perhaps she should have. The press conference had exposed so much more than just a company scandal. It had exposed their deepest rift, the one they had been trying to ignore for months. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the phone as she stared at his message. She knew the moment was coming, the moment when everything she had hoped to prevent would come crashing down. She took a deep breath and dialed his number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Jules," Alexander said, his voice tight. "I'm on my way to your hotel. We need to talk. This has gone too far." "I know," Julia replied softly, her voice betraying the calm she was trying to maintain. "I never wanted it to get to this point, Alex. But I couldn't just sit by and let it keep happening." There was a long pause. Julia could hear the rustling of papers on the other end of the line. The same sounds of a man scrambling to keep his company together, to keep his world from crumbling. "You've exposed everything," he said, the frustration evident in his voice. "Do you understand what you've done? This isn't just about some internal policy or a few bad employees. This is a public relations nightmare. We've got board members calling, threatening legal action. They want to disown me, and I'm not even sure I can stop it." Julia felt a pang of guilt, but she pushed it down. She had done what she believed was right. "Alex, I know you're angry, but you have to see that this—" She stopped herself, her words catching. She had wanted to say, "This isn't about the company," but realized how wrong that would sound. "Do I?" Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. "Do I see? You've embarrassed me, Jules. This isn't just a fight for justice. You've made it personal." Her breath caught in her chest. She had known this was coming, but hearing the accusation from him, the man who had once stood by her no matter what, stung more than she anticipated. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alex," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But this is bigger than us. This is about what's happening to people. The system you've built, it's broken. And if I didn't say something, if I didn't expose it, who would?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Julia wasn't sure if he would answer. But then, finally, she heard him speak again, his tone softer now, as though he were struggling to find the words. "I don't know what to do anymore, Jules," he said quietly. "I don't even recognize my own company. It's become something I never wanted. And you're right. I've been too focused on growth, on keeping up with the competition. I lost sight of what Skyline was supposed to be." Julia's heart tightened. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when Alexander finally acknowledged the problem, when the walls between them started to crack. But even as his words landed, she felt a deep sense of sorrow. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the man who had wanted to change the world. She wiped away a tear that had formed, her voice steady but emotional. "We can fix it, Alex. It's going to take time and it's going to take effort, but we can fix it. Together." Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if we can. The damage is already done." Julia's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but through it all, one thought kept pushing its way to the front. "We have to try. Just give me one chance," she said, her voice pleading. "One chance to make this right. One chance to bring back the company you wanted. Please." There was a long pause, and for a moment Julia thought he might end the call, that he might walk away from her again. But then he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of everything they had just gone through. "Okay," he said, a soft sigh escaping his lips. "Okay, we'll try. But we need to act fast. We need to fix this before it gets any worse. Before we lose everything." Julia closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. They still had a chance. They still had the opportunity to rebuild, to fix what had been broken. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart swelling with hope. "We'll do it together. We'll make it right." As the call ended, Julia sat in the quiet of the room, the weight of the conversation lingering. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Julia walked through the sprawling halls of Skyline Airways corporate headquarters, her steps echoing against the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the tension that had settled over the company since the press conference. News outlets were abuzz. The story had gone viral, and with each passing hour, the pressure was mounting. But today, Julia wasn't just here to meet with the media or discuss the fallout. She was here to make sure the change she had ignited didn't fizzle out. After her conversation with Alexander, they had agreed to take the first steps toward rebuilding the company's values. But the real work was just beginning. Alexander had already called an emergency meeting with the executive board, and Julia knew the conversation would be pivotal. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just how to fix the internal systems. It was whether they would embrace the drastic changes necessary or continue clinging to the old way of doing things, the way that had led them to this crisis in the first place. As she approached the conference room, Julia felt a mixture of determination and wariness. The board members were already seated around the large, oval table, their faces a blend of apprehension and guarded expressions. Caroline Winters, the chief of customer experience, sat at the head of the table, her posture stiff and her eyes narrowed in what Julia recognized as a defensive stance. Caroline had been one of the main architects of the policies that had allowed discrimination to thrive at Skyline, and now she was looking at Julia like she was an intruder on what used to be her territory. Julia stepped into the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. She could feel the eyes of the executives on her as she took a seat across from Caroline. Alexander was beside her, and his quiet support gave her a sense of resolve. "Let's get started," Alexander said, his voice firm. "We all know why we're here today. We've been exposed. The practices at Skyline have hurt our customers, and it's time to address the damage head-on. Julia has already made her case publicly, and now it's our turn to act." There was a heavy silence before one of the board members, David Grant, cleared his throat. He was the company's CFO, a man who had always focused more on the numbers than on the people behind the products. "You're asking us to dismantle everything that's made us successful," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Our loyalty programs, our premium services. Those things are what set us apart from the competition." Julia leaned forward, meeting David's eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice calm but forceful. "But what you fail to realize is that what set us apart in the beginning, what made Skyline stand out, was our commitment to treating everyone with dignity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. And now, we've built a system that prioritizes wealth and appearance over respect and fairness. That's not a foundation we can stand on any longer." The room grew tense, but no one interrupted. Caroline shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. Julia could see her calculating, deciding whether or not to speak up. Finally, she did. "With all due respect, Julia," Caroline said, her voice icy, "these changes you're proposing could cost us millions. We can't just throw away the policies that have been so effective. The customers who pay for first-class tickets, they expect luxury. They expect exclusivity. And if we start treating everyone equally, we might lose the competitive edge that's kept us on top." Julia didn't back down. "What we're talking about isn't equality in the sense of lowering our standards. It's about restoring dignity to every passenger, whether they're in first class or economy. We need to be about the experience, not just the ticket price. That's the change we need to make. We need to rebuild trust." Another board member, Susan Hale, who oversaw public relations, spoke up. "Julia, we all know how hard it's been to maintain our image as a luxury brand. But your point about trust is valid. If we don't do something, we'll lose everything. The backlash could drive customers away, and our reputation will be irreparably damaged." Julia nodded. "Exactly. The truth is out now, and the only way forward is through transparency. We need to show our customers, our employees, and our shareholders that Skyline is about more than profits. It's about values. It's about treating people right." Alexander shifted in his seat, his voice steady but with an underlying frustration. "I agree. We're going to make the necessary changes, even if it costs us in the short term. I've already made that decision. But this isn't just a policy shift. It's going to require a cultural shift. And we all have to be on board if it's going to work. The silence in the room was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like the executives were all wrestling with the enormity of what was being asked of them. Finally, Caroline spoke, her tone less confident than before. You're asking us to change the way we've been operating for years. That's not something we can do overnight. Julia met her gaze without flinching. No, it won't be easy. But that doesn't mean we don't do it. We're asking for more than just a shift in policy. We're asking for a shift in mindset. We can't keep prioritizing appearances and profits over people. Not anymore. Another long pause. Then, to Julia's surprise, it was David Grant who spoke again. I agree with you, he said, his voice softer than before. We've been so focused on the financial side of things that we've lost touch with what really matters. If we want to save this company, we need to change. We need to go back to the core principles that made Skyline what it was in the beginning. Julia looked at him, surprised by his sudden support. Exactly. And if we can't do that, then we'll lose everything. But we have the power to fix it. We just need the will to change. The room was still for a long moment as the executives looked at one another, weighing the decision in front of them. Julia could feel the tide turning in their favor, but it wasn't enough yet. There was still so much work to be done. She glanced at Alexander, who gave her a subtle nod, an unspoken signal that they were ready to move forward together. And then, as if the collective weight of the decision had been lifted, Alexander spoke again. All right, we'll begin the overhaul. We'll launch new policies that ensure respect for all customers, regardless of their status or appearance. We'll focus on rebuilding trust, and we'll show the world that Skyline stands for something more than just luxury travel. Julia nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with determination. The battle wasn't over, but this was the first step toward change. The company was going to have to take a hard look at itself, and so was she. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, late nights, and endless discussions. Julia worked closely with Alexander, Caroline, and the board members to implement the changes they had promised. It was a slow process, one that required more than just a shift in policy. It required a complete cultural transformation. The road ahead was difficult, but there was a sense of purpose that kept them moving forward. Julia knew that if they didn't act quickly, the damage to Skyline's reputation would be irreversible. The first step was to overhaul the internal policies that had allowed discrimination to thrive. They restructured the loyalty programs, removing the emphasis on appearance and status, and replaced them with programs that focused on customer service, fairness, and respect. The reward system was adjusted to prioritize employee performance and customer satisfaction, rather than adherence to superficial standards. But the real challenge was changing the mindset of the employees. They needed to understand that treating people equally wasn't just a policy. It was a core value that had to be embedded in every part of the company. Caroline, who had once been a staunch defender of the old system, found herself in a difficult position. She had lost much of her influence in the company, and while she agreed with the new direction, she struggled to let go of the old ways that had brought her success. There were moments when Julia saw the cracks in her armor, the brief hesitation when discussing new initiatives, the occasional sigh when faced with the discomfort of change. But Caroline, to her credit, eventually threw herself into the process, fully embracing the shift in direction, even though it was clear she was doing so begrudgingly. Julia worked with the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee, a group of employees from all levels of the company who would serve as ambassadors for the new culture. They were tasked with spreading the message of respect and equality throughout the organization, ensuring that every employee, from the flight attendants to the executives, understood the importance of treating all passengers with dignity. This committee would also provide feedback on the changes being implemented, making sure that the company's new policies were not just words on paper but actions in practice. The media attention was relentless. While the scandal had been shocking, there were many who admired the transparency and willingness to change that Julia and Alexander were demonstrating. They were held up as examples of corporate leaders who had the courage to confront the flaws within their own company. Yet, there were also critics who questioned the viability of their plan. Would Skyline still be able to compete with other luxury airlines without the policies that had set it apart? Would the changes cost too much, both financially and reputationally? Julia knew they were walking a tightrope. Every decision had to be weighed carefully, and there were moments when doubt crept in. Was this truly the right path, or was it too idealistic? She had to remind herself that the purpose of the company had never been just to make money. It had been about changing the way people traveled, about creating a space where dignity wasn't a luxury. As the days passed, the board began to see the positive effects of the changes. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Passengers who had felt neglected and devalued by the old system began to share their stories, praising the airline for its commitment to respect and fairness. There were still challenges, of course. Some employees struggled to adjust, and there were tensions with the senior management, who had spent years benefiting from the old ways. But the momentum was undeniable. Julia's personal life, however, was still in flux. She and Alexander had many difficult conversations, some of which were painful and raw. They were no longer just partners in business. They were partners in rebuilding their lives and their company. The strain of the past few months had worn on them both, and while they were committed to the changes they were making at Skyline, they also had to confront the changes within their relationship. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Julia asked, "Do you think we've done the right thing?" Alexander, who had been quiet for a while, finally looked at her. His expression was thoughtful, almost distant. "I do," he said, his voice low. "But I also think we've both changed. I've changed. I didn't see the impact of my decisions until it was too late. I've been so focused on growth and expansion that I lost sight of what really mattered." Julia nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I know. I've been so focused on the right thing to do that I almost forgot to take care of what was closest to me. I don't want to lose sight of that either." There was a long pause, and for the first time in a long time, they sat in silence, not as business partners or public figures, but as two people trying to make sense of the mess they had found themselves in. Julia reached for his hand, and for a moment, everything felt like it might be okay. "Whatever happens," she said, squeezing his hand, "we'll face it together." Alexander looked at her, his eyes softening. "Together," he agreed. As the days turned into weeks, Skyline's transformation continued. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but there was progress. The company's internal culture was shifting, and customers were starting to see the difference. The media coverage began to change from scandalous headlines to stories of resilience and reform. Skyline was being watched closely, but for the first time in years, Julia felt hopeful about what lay ahead. But the journey was far from over. There were still deep wounds to heal, both within the company and within her relationship with Alexander. The true test would be how they handled the challenges that lay ahead, not just as leaders of Skyline, but as partners in life. The first sign that things were changing at Skyline came when Susan Hale, the head of public relations, walked into Julia's office with a wide grin on her face. "We've got something, Julia," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "We're getting positive feedback from passengers. Real, heartfelt feedback. The changes are making a difference." Julia looked up from her desk, her mind still racing with the endless tasks and decisions ahead. She had spent so much time worrying about the broader impact of their overhaul that she had almost forgotten what it was all for. Individuals, the people who had suffered because of the company's policies. The fact that the customers were finally starting to feel heard was a sign that the transformation was gaining traction. Susan handed her a stack of emails and testimonials, each one from a different passenger. "It's not just that they're happy with the service, Julia," Susan continued. "They're grateful. They feel respected, valued. It's everything you were hoping for." Julia took the stack, flipping through the pages quickly. The comments were overwhelming, full of praise for how Skyline had changed its approach to treating all passengers with dignity. One email stood out from the others. It was from a middle-aged woman who had flown first class just weeks before the changes were announced. She wrote, "I've flown with Skyline for years, but I never felt truly respected. I was often made to feel like I didn't belong, despite paying for the most expensive ticket. But something changed this time. I was treated like a human being, and that made all the difference. I'm coming back because I believe in what you're doing. Keep it up. Julia felt a lump form in her throat. She could already see the beginning of something monumental, but she knew this was just the start. The real work was in ensuring that these feelings of respect weren't just temporary. The policies had been overhauled, but the culture shift needed to be deep-rooted in the company's DNA. It would take time. Have you spoken to Alexander about this? Susan asked, noticing Julia's thoughtful expression. Julia nodded. We've discussed it, but I think we're both trying to manage the fallout while keeping our focus on moving forward. He's still trying to deal with the board. The resistance is stronger than we expected. Susan smiled wryly. They're all about profits, aren't they? They want to see the results, not just hear about them. Julia couldn't help but laugh, despite the gravity of the situation. Exactly. But it's not just about results anymore. It's about making the right choices, even if it costs us. Her words lingered in the room as she returned to the testimonials. She was right. Every decision they made now had to be about rebuilding Skyline from the inside out, treating employees and customers with respect, regardless of their status or appearance. It wasn't just about the airline. It was about creating a new model, one that would set a standard for the entire industry. As the days went on, the company's internal policies were slowly beginning to shift. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee had been meeting regularly, working on guidelines to ensure the company's newly implemented policies were actively followed at every level. The committee was made up of employees from all departments, providing a cross-sectional approach to reform. The goal wasn't just to change the rules on paper. It was to ensure that everyone at Skyline understood the new mission and felt accountable for upholding it. Julia found herself meeting with the committee almost every day, discussing new ideas, refining the processes, and brainstorming ways to keep the momentum going. She could feel the shift within the company, but it was clear that there was still a long way to go before the deep-rooted biases that had been a part of Skyline for so long were fully eradicated. One afternoon, as Julia sat in one of these meetings, Caroline Winters entered the room, looking unusually composed. She had been notably distant since the press conference, but Julia could tell something had changed in her. Caroline had always been one to defend the old policies, but now her posture was different, less defensive, more open. I've been thinking, Caroline began, taking a seat at the table, about the new training programs we've developed. I've come to realize that this isn't just about customer service. It's about personal growth. We're asking our employees to be better people, to treat people better, and to not judge others based on what they see. Julia watched her, surprised by the sincerity in Caroline's words. This was the first time she'd truly seen her embrace the idea of change. It had taken time, but Caroline seemed to be coming around. Julia knew it wouldn't be easy, but if Caroline could make this shift, maybe the rest of the company could follow. You're right, Julia said, her voice calm but determined. This isn't just about service. It's about changing the way we see each other. It's about empathy. If we can teach people to treat others with respect, regardless of their background, we'll have done something far more important than changing an airline. We'll have changed the way people think. Caroline nodded. I'm on board. I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready to help make it happen. Julia smiled, feeling the first real sense of hope she had in a long time. It wasn't just about policies and strategies, it was about changing hearts and minds. That, Julia realized, was where true transformation would begin. As the meeting wrapped up, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pride. Skyline wasn't out of the woods yet. There were still challenges ahead, but the company was moving in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, Julia felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. Something that could change the industry, change the world. But she knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. Not yet. There were still so many hurdles to overcome. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity as Skyline continued to implement the changes Julia had set in motion. The company's internal culture was slowly but steadily evolving. Employees who had once clung to the old ways were beginning to see the benefits of the new policies. The more they heard from passengers, the more they understood that the company's success wasn't just about luxury. It was about fostering respect and dignity for everyone who walked through the doors. But even with all the positive changes, there were still moments when Julia felt the weight of what she had done. The pressure of managing the company's transformation, along with the media scrutiny, was wearing on her. She had been pulled in 1,000 different directions. Press interviews, meetings with the board, overseeing the restructuring, and still trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her personal life. She could feel herself getting stretched thinner and thinner, and she knew she couldn't keep up this pace forever. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Julia returned home to find Alexander sitting in the living room, looking at his phone. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks still lingered, but now there was a sense of quiet understanding. They had both been working hard, perhaps too hard, and the strain of everything that had happened had started to show in their interactions. "Hey," Julia said softly as she entered, setting her briefcase down by the door. "How's it going with the board?" Alexander looked up at her, his face tired but determined. "We're making progress," he said. "The pushback has been strong, but we're holding steady. They want results, but they're starting to realize that we can't just chase profit at any cost. We have to show that we can balance both respect and success." Julia nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. It was clear that he was still grappling with the fallout from their decisions. "What about you?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "How are you holding up?" Julia sighed, sinking into the chair next to him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm doing everything I can, but I feel like I'm losing control of everything. The company's shifting, but it's so slow, and I'm running out of energy to keep pushing. I can't keep this up forever, Alex." Alexander reached for her hand, his grip firm but comforting. "You don't have to do this alone, Jules. We're in this together. I've been so focused on fixing the business that I've neglected you and us. But I'm here. We'll get through this together. I promise." For the first time in weeks, Julia allowed herself to relax, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders. It had been so long since they had connected like this, without the pressure of work or the constant stress of the company. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this. "I just want things to get better," she said quietly. "For the company, for us. I want to see the change we're making really take root." "I know," Alexander replied. "We will. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. And whatever happens, we'll make sure it's worth it." For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through finally giving way to a shared sense of purpose. It was a small victory, but in that moment, Julia felt the first real sense of peace she had felt in a long time. The next few days were a whirlwind of decisions, meetings, and follow-ups. Skyline was beginning to see some positive results from its new approach. The company was receiving more praise from customers who had once felt dismissed or neglected. The media coverage was shifting, too, with outlets praising Skyline's bold move toward equality and respect. Julia knew they were far from being out of the woods, but the progress was undeniable. But with every positive step, there came new challenges. The board, though they had agreed to the changes in principle, was growing impatient. They wanted to see more than just customer satisfaction. They wanted profits. They wanted to see a return on the changes that had been made. And, as always, they were looking at the bottom line. One afternoon, as Julia sat in yet another meeting with the board, the pressure started to build again. David Grant, the CFO, was the first to speak. "We're seeing the positive feedback from customers, but we need to see financial growth. We can't continue with these new initiatives if they're not showing a direct return. The shareholders want to know when they'll start seeing results." Julia felt a pang of frustration, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand, David, but the results aren't going to come overnight. These changes aren't just about profit. They're about creating a sustainable, ethical business model. We're building something that will last, but it takes time." David's expression hardened. "I'm not saying we should abandon the plan," he said. "But if we don't see results in the next quarter, we're going to face some serious questions from the investors." Julia's pulse quickened, but she kept her calm. She knew that Skyline had no choice but to keep moving forward. The company couldn't afford to backtrack now, not after everything that had been sacrificed to make these changes. "We're going to see results," she said firmly. "But it's going to take time. The people we're trying to reach, those who've been neglected for years, they need to know that we're genuinely committed to change. And that means doing things differently, even if it costs us a little in the short term." The room was silent for a moment as the board members exchanged glances. It was clear that they were nervous. The pressure was mounting, but Julia knew they couldn't afford to give in. They had already come so far. She would not let the company, and everything she had worked for, fall back into the hands of the people who had gotten them into this mess in the first place. The sound of the door clicking shut behind her felt final. Julia stood in the hallway of the Skyline headquarters, her fingers gripping the cold metal handle as if it could steady her thoughts. The board meeting had not gone well, and the tension between her and the investors had never been thicker. The reality of their impatience was sinking in. They wanted results, but they didn't seem to understand that change, true systemic change, took time. She had presented the customer feedback and the early signs of financial improvement, but it hadn't been enough. The shareholders wanted more than just a moral victory. They wanted numbers. They wanted guarantees that their investment would pay off in a tangible way, and they weren't willing to wait for things to unfold naturally. It felt like they were measuring success by short-term profits, not by the long-term impact of the transformation. As she walked down the hallway, Julia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone vibrating in her pocket. She pulled it out to see Alexander's name flashing on the screen. For a moment, she hesitated. The board's response had put a strain on their already fragile relationship, and she wasn't sure if this conversation would bring them closer or further apart. With a deep breath, Julia answered. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I saw the meeting," Alexander said, his voice tight. "How did it go?" Julia felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over her, the day's events catching up to her. "It didn't go as we hoped," she admitted. "The board isn't ready to be patient. They want results, and they want them fast." There was a pause on the other end. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know," Julia replied, rubbing her temple. "It's like they don't understand that this isn't just about profits. It's about rebuilding trust. The passengers are responding, but the numbers, they're not where they want them yet." She could hear the frustration in his sigh. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he said. "But we have to stick to our principles, Jules. We can't give in to their demands." "I'm not giving in," Julia responded quickly. "But I'm starting to feel like we're fighting a battle on two fronts. The board wants to see numbers, but the change we're trying to create won't show up overnight. We're stuck between doing what's right and meeting their demands. And I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Alexander paused again, and Julia could hear the rustling of papers on his end. She could imagine him sitting at his desk, his face set with determination. "We need to make it clear to them that this isn't just about making money. It's about the foundation of Skyline, what it was built on, and what it needs to stand for moving forward. We're not just changing policies, Jules. We're changing the way people think." "I know," Julia said softly, leaning against the wall. "I just don't know how to convince them. We've made so many changes, but it's not enough for them." "We'll have to show them," Alexander replied. "We'll show them that the change is real, not just in customer satisfaction, but in how we do business every single day. We'll prove it with our actions, even if they don't believe it at first." His words carried the weight of the decisions they had already made, and for a moment, Julia felt a flicker of hope. Alexander had always been the driving force behind Skyline, and in moments like this, she was reminded of why they had started all of this in the first place. It wasn't just about making a profit, it was about creating something that mattered, something that stood for more than just success. "You're right," she said, her voice steadier now. "We'll keep pushing forward. We'll show them. I won't back down." "Neither will I," Alexander said, the determination in his voice clear. "We'll figure this out together, Jules. Just keep the faith. We've got this." Julia hung up the phone and leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The road ahead was still uncertain, But she knew that with Alexander by her side, they could navigate whatever came next. The battle wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But they had already made it this far, and they would keep pushing no matter the obstacles. With renewed resolve, Julia straightened and turned to face the next challenge. There was still so much to do, and she couldn't afford to waste another moment. She would prove to the board, to the passengers, and to herself that the changes they had started at Skyline were not only possible, they were inevitable. The following days were a mix of exhaustion and anticipation as Julia and Alexander strategized the next steps for Skyline. They had agreed on a plan to prove the viability of their new direction, one that focused on long-term value over immediate financial gains. But making that vision a reality was more complicated than they had anticipated. With the board breathing down their necks, Julia spent countless hours preparing detailed reports, gathering more customer testimonials, and working closely with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. She was determined to show the board that the changes weren't just about better customer service. They were about creating a culture that valued people over profits. But each time she presented data that reflected the initial success of their transformation, the board members remained skeptical. They needed more tangible, immediate proof that the company's new approach would result in a return on investment. In the midst of the growing pressure, an unexpected ally emerged, Caroline Winters. After weeks of strained interactions, Caroline approached Julia one afternoon, her expression unreadable. "I think I've figured out a way to help," Caroline said, her voice softer than usual. Julia looked up from her desk, surprised by the sudden shift in Caroline's tone. "Help how?" Julia asked cautiously, still unsure of Caroline's full commitment to the changes. Caroline took a deep breath and set a proposal on Julia's desk. "We need to be more proactive in showcasing the impact of our changes, beyond just customer feedback. The board won't listen to abstract concepts. We need numbers, and we need them now. We need to show how the transformation is impacting our bottom line, and I think I've found a way to do it." Julia raised an eyebrow, eyeing the proposal. "What are you suggesting?" "We can partner with a third-party organization to conduct an independent audit of our customer service performance, focusing specifically on our new policies regarding equality and respect for all passengers. We'll compare the results with our previous performance, showing clear improvement in both customer satisfaction and retention. If we present that data, along with the loyalty program changes and our adjusted policies, it could give us the tangible proof the board is looking for." Julia was taken aback. "You think the board will accept that? An independent audit could help, but it's not just about the numbers. It's about shifting the entire culture of the company. It's about showing them that this is more than just a marketing tool." Caroline's eyes softened slightly, and Julia could see a glimpse of the woman who had once fought for Skyline's founding values. "I know," Caroline said, "but it's a start. Something concrete that will help buy us time. If we can get the board to back us for a little longer, we can show them that this transformation isn't just some short-term trend. It's the future of Skyline." Julia thought for a moment, weighing the risks. A third-party audit could give them the evidence they needed, but it would also put more pressure on the company to deliver immediate results. If the audit didn't reflect the changes they were hoping for, it could backfire. But at this point, Julia didn't see any other option. They needed to prove their point, and they needed to do it fast. "Okay," Julia said, finally giving in. "Let's do it. But we have to make sure the audit is thorough. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure the results are as reflective of the changes as possible." Caroline nodded. "I'll handle the logistics. We'll bring in the right people to make sure everything is above board." As Caroline left to start the process, Julia felt a flicker of hope. This could work. If they could prove to the board that their new approach was paying off, they might be able to buy the time they needed to solidify the cultural shift within Skyline. But deep down, Julia knew it wasn't going to be easy. The board would be watching every step, and there were still employees who had yet to fully embrace the new vision. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of preparations for the audit and more board meetings. Julia spent long hours at her desk, poring over data, working with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and trying to figure out how to balance the demands of the board with the need for systemic change. The pressure was relentless, but every time Julia felt like she was at her breaking point, She found herself looking at the testimonials from passengers, the stories of real people who had been impacted by the changes. That was what kept her going. She couldn't back down now. One evening, as Julia walked through the nearly empty headquarters, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "The board wants to meet with us tomorrow. They've seen the initial audit results. They're not convinced, but we need to show them that this is real." Julia took a deep breath. Tomorrow was going to be the day that determined everything. The audit results had shown some improvements in customer satisfaction and retention, but it wasn't enough. They needed more proof, more evidence that the changes they had implemented were sustainable. She thought about the conversation she had had with Alexander weeks ago, when they had first discussed the long-term vision for Skyline. Back then, it had seemed like such an idealistic goal, something far off in the distance. But now, the future of the company rested on whether or not they could convince the board that these changes were worth the wait. They had made a real impact on the lives of their passengers, and now it was time to show the board that it could lead to lasting success for the company as well. As she prepared for the meeting, Julia knew the stakes had never been higher. Tomorrow, everything would either come together or fall apart. The conference room was eerily quiet as the board members filed in one by one, their expressions as unreadable as ever. Julia stood at the front of the room, her nerves taut, but she forced herself to remain composed. This meeting was critical. This was the moment they had all been working toward. The results from the independent audit were in, and they would either validate everything they had fought for or bring Skyline's transformation to a screeching halt. As the last of the board members took their seats, Alexander gave Julia a reassuring nod from across the table. He had been with her every step of the way, but today, the weight of the situation was heavy on both their shoulders. The pressure to deliver something tangible to the board had never been higher. Julia opened the presentation on the screen, her fingers moving over the remote as she started the slideshow. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady. "Today, we'll be discussing the results of the independent audit we commissioned to assess the changes we've made at Skyline. As you know, we've worked hard to shift our focus to equality, respect, and customer satisfaction. The audit was designed to measure the impact of these changes, not just in terms of customer satisfaction, but in the broader context of how these policies affect our long-term growth." She clicked the remote, bringing up the first set of slides, graphs showing the changes in customer satisfaction and retention since the implementation of their new policies. There was a noticeable improvement in both categories, and Julia could feel the tension in the room shift ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She had the data to back up their efforts, and for the first time, the board seemed to be listening. "These numbers are promising," Julia continued, "but they don't tell the whole story. We've seen a marked improvement in customer retention and satisfaction, especially from the passengers who had felt alienated by our old system. The feedback we've received shows that our new approach is working, even if the financial impact isn't fully reflected yet." David Grant, the CFO, leaned forward in his chair, a frown on his face. "I'm not disputing the customer feedback," he said, his voice cold. "But customer satisfaction doesn't pay the bills. You've shown us that people are happier, but the question remains, how is this translating to revenue?" Julia clicked to the next slide, which presented the financials. There was a slight uptick in revenue, but nothing to impress the board. "As we expected, the financial gains are still modest," she acknowledged. "However, the most important takeaway is that this growth is sustainable. The loyalty of our customers is increasing, and the new focus on customer experience is something that will generate long-term success. What we're seeing now is the beginning of a transformation, not just for the passengers, but for our entire business model." "Julia, with all due respect," said Susan Hale, head of public relations, "we've been hearing the same thing for months now. Our reputation is slowly improving, but at what cost? We've made significant adjustments to our pricing structure and reward system, and it's affecting our margins. We need to see numbers. I'm not convinced that we've fully sold the board on this yet." Susan's words stung. Julia had anticipated this response, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. The board was a tough crowd, and they were still struggling to see the bigger picture. Julia understood their concerns. After all, Skyline had been a company built on luxury and exclusivity, on catering to those who could afford the best. Now, they were asking for a shift not just in policy but in perspective. "I understand the concerns," Julia said, keeping her voice even. "But we are on the right path. The short-term costs are necessary if we want to ensure that Skyline remains relevant in a rapidly changing market. More and more consumers are looking for brands that align with their values. If we continue down this path, focusing on dignity, respect, and inclusivity, we will attract the kind of customers who are loyal, not because of what they can afford, but because of the values we stand for." The room was silent for a moment, and Julia could see the wheels turning in the minds of the board members. Some of them were still skeptical, but there was a noticeable shift. They were starting to see the potential long-term gains, even if the immediate results weren't yet what they had hoped for. Finally, Caroline Winters spoke up. "I've been working closely with the customer experience teams, and I can confirm that we've seen a significant improvement in employee morale as well. Employees are starting to believe in the changes we've made. They're seeing the positive impact on passengers, and it's creating a more unified culture within the company." Julia nodded. Caroline's support was vital. She had been one of the most outspoken advocates for the old system, but seeing her change her stance over the past few months had been a sign that they were truly making progress. The transformation wasn't just happening in the customer service departments, it was starting to permeate the company culture as a whole. "This audit," Caroline continued, "is only the beginning. We need to continue implementing these changes and keep an eye on both short-term and long-term results. But I believe we're on the right track." Julia felt a surge of relief. Caroline's endorsement, combined with the positive feedback, was starting to sway the board in their favor. There was still a lot of work to be done, but they were making headway. The meeting continued with more questions and discussions, but Julia knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The board was beginning to understand the value of the changes they had implemented, but there was still resistance. Some of the members, especially those focused on the immediate financial returns, weren't ready to commit fully. They wanted more time, more data. Julia stood tall as the meeting came to a close, feeling a cautious optimism settle in her chest. They hadn't fully won the board over, but they had gained some ground. This wasn't the end, it was just another step toward the transformation they were trying to bring about. As she left the conference room, Alexander caught her eye, a quiet nod of acknowledgement passing between them. They still had a long road ahead, but today had been a victory. They had shown the board that Skyline's future wasn't just about profits. It was about building something sustainable, something that would stand the test of time. The following days after the board meeting were a blur of phone calls, follow-ups, and more strategy sessions. Julia and Alexander had won the board's tentative approval for their new direction, but the real work was just beginning. The pressure to deliver on the long-term vision was still heavy, and the investors' impatience was palpable. They had seen the early results from the audit, but now they needed to see the changes solidified, sustained, and most importantly, reflected in the bottom line. Julia spent her days meeting with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, reviewing reports, and working with the team to ensure that every department was aligned with the new vision. Meanwhile, Alexander dealt with the more immediate issues: managing the board, keeping the shareholders satisfied, and ensuring that the business side of the company continued to run smoothly. There were moments when Julia felt overwhelmed, like she was carrying the weight of the entire company on her shoulders. But the positive feedback continued to roll in, and that gave her hope. Passengers were noticing the difference. They felt heard, they felt seen, and, perhaps most importantly, they felt valued, not as wallets to be emptied, but as people deserving of respect. That was the core of everything they were building. One afternoon, as Julia sat in her office, going over some financial reports, there was a knock on the door. She looked up to see Caroline Winters standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile on her face. "Got a minute?" Caroline asked, her voice less guarded than it had been in the past. Julia gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Of course. Come in." Caroline took a seat, folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she began. "I know we've made a lot of changes recently, and not everyone's on board with it. But I've been thinking, the more I see, the more I believe in this. Julia raised an eyebrow, surprised by Caroline's words. You've been a big part of this transformation already. I'm glad to hear you're on board. Caroline nodded. I am. I guess I've been a little slow to fully get behind it, you know? But as I've seen the impact, especially with our employees and customers, it's becoming clearer. This is the future. We're doing something bigger than just changing an airline. We're changing the way people experience the world. Julia smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Caroline's support had always been crucial, but hearing her genuinely embrace the vision meant more than words could express. I'm glad to hear you say that. We've got a long road ahead, but I think we're on the right path. Caroline leaned back in her chair, her expression more thoughtful now. One thing I've noticed, especially with the employees, is that they're beginning to feel more empowered. There's this sense of purpose in the company that wasn't there before. They're not just working for a paycheck anymore. They're working for something they can believe in. Julia nodded. That's exactly what I want for Skyline. I want the employees to feel like they're part of something bigger. But it has to start with the leadership. We need to lead by example. I agree, Caroline said, her voice becoming more confident. And I think we should do more to recognize that. We need to celebrate the progress we've made, no matter how small, and encourage the people who are really embodying this change. Julia thought for a moment, then nodded. You're right. Maybe we should start looking at ways to highlight the people who are going above and beyond, living our values. Recognition could be a great motivator for others to follow suit. Caroline's face brightened at the idea. Exactly. We could hold internal awards or recognition programs. Celebrate the stories of employees who've gone above and beyond to make our passengers feel respected, not just served. Julia smiled, feeling a sense of momentum building. It wasn't just about what they were doing for the passengers. It was about empowering their employees to be part of the change too. If the entire company bought into the mission, the transformation would be unstoppable. Let's get started on that, Julia said. I'll bring it up at the next leadership meeting. We need to make sure everyone is recognized for the work they're putting in. It's all part of creating a culture of respect and accountability. As Caroline stood to leave, Julia felt a sense of pride. Skyline was starting to feel like the company she had always believed in, the one that Alexander had envisioned when they first launched it. But the journey wasn't over. There was still so much to do. She had to keep pushing, keep striving to make sure that the changes were not just temporary fixes, but permanent shifts in how they did business. The phone rang, pulling Julia out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, seeing that it was Susan Hale, the head of PR. Hi, Susan. What's up? Julia, you need to turn on the news, Susan said, her voice tense. There's been a report about one of our flights, an incident involving a passenger who was allegedly downgraded from first class for no reason. It's starting to gain traction. Julia's stomach dropped. Not again, she muttered. It's bad, Susan said. We need to address it fast. The media is all over it. Julia's mind raced as she stood up, her eyes scanning the office for a moment before she rushed toward the door. I'm on it. Let's get ahead of this, Susan. We can't let this derail everything we've been working for. She hung up the phone and turned to Caroline, who was still standing by the door. We've got a problem. Another incident, and the media is starting to catch wind of it. We need to act fast. Caroline nodded, her expression hardening. Let's do whatever it takes. We'll fix this. The media storm that followed the incident was far worse than Julia had anticipated. The passenger, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, had claimed that he was downgraded from first class to economy without explanation or apology. The story spread quickly, amplified by social media, and before long it was everywhere. The hashtag Skyline disrespect began trending, and the public outcry was deafening. It didn't matter that the incident was isolated or that there had been a legitimate mix-up with overbooking. The narrative that Skyline was discriminating against passengers was already set in stone, and now Julia had to do everything she could to stop the damage from becoming irreparable. She paced back and forth in her office, her thoughts racing as she stared at the phone screen. The story had broken during the morning news cycle, and by the time the afternoon news came around, there was no avoiding it. The board was already starting to panic, the calls and emails flooding in from investors who were worried about the hit to their stock. She could feel the pressure mounting with every passing minute, and she knew that this situation, more than any other, could make or break the changes they had worked so hard to implement. The phone rang again, and this time it was Alexander. Julia didn't hesitate before answering. "Hey," she said, her voice tense. "This is bad." "I know," Alexander replied, his voice grim. "I've been watching the coverage. What's the plan?" Julia took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "We need to take control of the narrative. If we don't get ahead of this, the media is going to spin it out of control. We can't let them paint us as a company that doesn't care about its passengers. We need to address this immediately, publicly." "Are we ready for that?" Alexander asked, concern lacing his voice. "This isn't just about a bad PR moment. It's about the trust we've worked so hard to rebuild." Julia nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see it. "I'm aware, but we've spent too much time working on this for one mistake to undo it all. We need to speak directly to the public. Let them know that this doesn't reflect who we are." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Do you think the board will back us?" "We don't have a choice," Julia said firmly. "We've built this on transparency and respect, and now it's time to live up to it. I'll draft a statement for the press, and we'll hold a public apology. I'll make sure it's clear that this is a one-off issue, and it won't happen again." "All right," Alexander said after a beat. "I'll handle the board. We need them on our side, even if it's just for damage control." Julia hung up the phone and immediately started typing. She had always been quick with words, but this was different. This needed to be sincere, firm, and unwavering. They had to show the world that they were not going to let a single incident define them, that they were committed to a culture of inclusivity and respect, no matter what. As she drafted the statement, Julia reflected on how far they had come. When they first started, Skyline was a company focused on exclusivity and luxury. They had built their brand on the idea of catering to the elite, creating an air of superiority for their first-class passengers. But over the months, they had torn down that ideology piece by piece, replacing it with something more universal: dignity for all passengers, regardless of their class or status. She could feel the weight of those changes pressing on her now. One mistake, one incident that played into old stereotypes, could undo everything they had built. Julia couldn't afford to let that happen. She finished the statement, quickly outlining their commitment to investigating the situation, implementing further training for staff, and reinforcing their new policies. The message was clear. This was not who they were, and they would do everything in their power to ensure it never happened again. After sending the draft to her PR team for review, Julia turned her attention to the next immediate step: the public apology. The media would be relentless, and she knew that their words, their actions in the coming days, would either restore faith or push the company further into crisis. But she had no intention of letting that happen. The press conference was scheduled for the next day, and Julia spent the evening preparing her remarks. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. The media had already been quick to latch onto the narrative of Skyline's failure to uphold its newly adopted values. The backlash was swift, and the damage to their reputation had already been done. But Julia was determined not to let the story spiral out of control. She needed to take charge of the conversation. The following morning, as she stood in front of the press, she felt a weight settle on her shoulders. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and journalists, all eager for answers, for a glimpse of vulnerability. Julia wasn't going to give them that. She wasn't there to offer excuses. She was there to take responsibility and show the public that Skyline was still a company worthy of their trust. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Julia Montgomery, and I'm here today to address the recent incident involving one of our passengers. I want to start by saying that we deeply regret the experience that Mr. Harrington had with us. This does not reflect the values that Skyline stands for, and it certainly does not reflect the commitment we have made to treat every passenger with respect, dignity, and fairness." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. We have always prided ourselves on providing a high level of service, but we realize now that we've failed in this instance. Our internal policies and procedures were not followed correctly, and that is on us. We are investigating this matter thoroughly and taking immediate action to ensure this does not happen again. A reporter quickly raised his hand, and Julia gestured for him to speak. But how can you assure the public that this is an isolated incident? Skyline has been under scrutiny for a while now. How do we know this isn't just the tip of the iceberg? Julia had expected this question, and she was ready for it. I understand your concern, she said, and I want to be clear. This incident is not a reflection of our company as a whole. We have worked tirelessly over the last several months to implement policies that promote equality, respect, and fairness. However, we realize that one mistake, one oversight, can undo all of that hard work. That's why we are doubling down on our commitment to these values. She continued, her voice growing steadier as she made her case. We are immediately launching a full review of our internal procedures to ensure that all of our employees are aligned with our core values. We are also expanding our employee training program to reinforce the principles of inclusivity and respect. We want to ensure that every person, regardless of their appearance, background, or social status, is treated with the dignity they deserve when they choose to fly with Skyline. The room fell silent for a moment, and Julia could feel the weight of every eye on her. She had anticipated the scrutiny, but she also knew that what she was saying was the truth. They had made mistakes, but they were going to fix them. This wasn't just about repairing their reputation. It was about staying true to the vision that had driven Skyline in the first place. A reporter from a major news outlet spoke up. You're talking a lot about change, but many passengers feel like they've been mistreated for years. How can they trust that Skyline will actually follow through this time? What guarantees do you have for them? Julia didn't flinch. I understand that trust has been broken, she said, and I know it will take time to rebuild that trust. But we are committed to doing whatever it takes to earn it back. This is not just about one apology or one initiative. It's about an ongoing effort to ensure that we are always improving, always learning, and always putting our passengers first. If we can't do that, then we don't deserve to lead this company. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the reporters, hoping they could see the sincerity in her words. Skyline has always stood for excellence. But now we're going to redefine what excellence means. We're going to be a company that doesn't just serve the wealthy or the powerful. We're going to be a company that serves everyone. And we're going to make sure that no one ever feels like they don't belong. Julia ended the press conference with a brief statement, thanking the media for their time and assuring them that more updates would come as the investigation progressed. As she left the stage, she felt a brief sense of relief wash over her. She had said what needed to be said. The hard part was far from over, but at least they had a clear path forward. Back in her office, Julia sat down and exhaled deeply. The room was still buzzing with the fallout from the conference, but for the first time in days, she felt like they had taken a step in the right direction. They had owned up to their mistakes, and now they had to follow through. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot, but they had laid the groundwork for change. And that, at least, was something. As the days passed, the media storm began to die down, but the real work was just beginning. Julia, Alexander, and the entire leadership team had a long road ahead of them. They had promised to change the culture of Skyline, and now they had to prove that their words meant something. But Julia was determined. She knew the challenges wouldn't stop, but she also knew that Skyline had the potential to become something truly revolutionary. They had to rebuild from the inside out, and she was ready to lead the charge. The morning of the final board meeting had arrived, and Julia felt a nervous energy vibrating in the pit of her stomach. It was not the kind of nerves that came from fear but from anticipation. This meeting would determine everything: the success of their new direction, the future of the company, and her own legacy within Skyline. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, analyzing every aspect of their journey and looking ahead to the challenges still ahead. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the city below. The skyline that had inspired the company's name was just visible through the glass. a silent reminder of how far they had come. He turned to her, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You ready?" he asked. Julia nodded, though her heart was racing. "As ready as I'll ever be." "You've done the hard work," Alexander continued, his voice steady. "Now it's time to let them see what we've built. We're in this together, Jules. Always." Her heart swelled at his words, the support she had craved throughout this entire process finally sinking in. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about their vision, their values, and the impact they were going to have on the world. Skyline had started as a dream for them both, and now they were about to turn it into something bigger than they could have ever imagined. As they entered the boardroom, the mood was noticeably different than the last time they had met. Gone were the whispers of doubt and hesitation. The members of the board were seated around the large conference table, their faces set in neutral expressions. Julia could feel their eyes on her, assessing, waiting. This was the moment where they would either solidify their belief in the new direction or walk away from it. She stood at the head of the table, Alexander by her side. "Thank you all for being here," Julia began, her voice calm but commanding. "We've made a lot of changes at Skyline in the past few months. Changes that I know weren't easy and changes that, at times, have felt like they were at odds with our history. But I stand here today confident that we are on the right path. Our company's future is brighter than it's ever been, and that future is built on the core values of dignity, respect, and equality for every passenger who walks through our doors." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others still looking skeptical. Julia pressed on, her voice growing more confident with each word. "We've seen the early results. Customer satisfaction is up, employee morale has improved, and we've created a culture where everyone feels like they belong, not just in the seats they pay for, but in every aspect of our company. The changes we've made are already yielding positive results, but I know the journey isn't over. We have a responsibility to not just be successful, but to do so in a way that reflects who we are at our core." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in before moving to the next slide in her presentation. It displayed the data they had collected, the steady increase in customer satisfaction, the higher retention rates, and the positive feedback they had received from passengers and employees alike. It was proof that their vision was working. But Julia knew that the numbers, though important, weren't enough to win over the skeptics in the room. "This is not just about numbers," she continued, her gaze moving from one board member to the next. "This is about the kind of company we want to be." Skyline started with a vision of democratizing air travel, treating everyone with the dignity they deserve, regardless of how much they can pay. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But today, we are taking a stand. We are reaffirming that mission. And with that mission comes not just the promise of financial growth, but the promise of lasting change that will be felt in every corner of our company, and by every person who flies with us. There was a slight shift in the atmosphere, the tension beginning to loosen as Julia spoke. She could see it. Some of the board members were starting to soften. They were seeing the bigger picture, understanding that the changes weren't just about short-term profits, but about building a long-term legacy. David Grant, the CFO, was the first to speak up. "You've shown us the numbers, Julia," he said, his tone more measured than before. "And I have to admit, I'm impressed by the increase in customer loyalty. It's hard to argue with that kind of data, but I still have concerns about the financial impact of all these changes." Julia nodded, anticipating his question. "I understand, and I won't pretend that the transition hasn't come with challenges. But I also believe that we are positioning Skyline to be the airline of the future. An airline that doesn't just cater to the wealthy elite, but to everyone who values dignity and respect in their travel experience. Our long-term growth will come from fostering loyalty and building trust with passengers, not just from charging the highest ticket prices." She paused for a moment, meeting each of their gazes, ensuring they understood the depth of her conviction. "We are investing in something bigger than profit. We are investing in the future of air travel, a future where every passenger feels like they belong, and every employee feels valued. And if we stay true to these values, the financial rewards will follow." Alexander stepped forward, adding his voice to the conversation. "We are in this for the long haul," he said, his tone firm. "We've already seen the positive impact these changes are having on our employees, and we've started to see the results in customer satisfaction. We know it will take time, but we're willing to put in the work to ensure Skyline's future success." Julia looked at him, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. They had come so far, and now this was the moment they had worked toward, the moment they would prove that their vision for Skyline wasn't just a dream, but a reality that could be achieved. The room was still, the weight of the moment hanging in the air as the board members absorbed the words Julia and Alexander had shared. A few exchanged quiet glances, murmuring among themselves. The silence stretched, the tension palpable as the final decision loomed over them. Finally, Susan Hale, the head of public relations, broke the silence. Her eyes met Julia's with a mixture of acknowledgement and resolve. "I have to admit, this has been a hard sell for some of us," she began, her voice steady. "But I see what you're building. It's not just about making money anymore. It's about restoring the integrity of Skyline. We've seen enough signs of progress in the last few months to understand that this could work in the long term." Julia felt a small weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Susan's support was important, but it wasn't final approval. The other members of the board were still watching carefully, waiting for someone to take a stand either for or against the new direction. David Grant, the CFO, was the next to speak. His expression was less skeptical than before, but the financials were still his focus. "I'm convinced by the data," he said slowly. "The customer satisfaction numbers are impressive, and I've seen a shift in employee morale. But we need to be certain that the costs won't outweigh the long-term benefits. We've made some pretty significant changes to our pricing model, and while it's important to have a moral compass, we also need to keep our financials strong." Julia could feel the gears turning in her head as she responded. "David, I agree. But the foundation we're building with these changes is about more than just numbers. We're aligning our financial growth with our ethical commitments. It's not about sacrificing profits for the sake of goodwill. It's about ensuring that the two can work together in harmony. Our vision isn't about cutting corners to increase margins, but about creating something sustainable and deeply connected to our passengers' needs." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This company is more than an airline. It's an experience. Our customers want to feel that their choice to fly with Skyline means something, that it's about more than just luxury. It's about respect, dignity, and fairness. And the financial stability will follow. It will be steady, reliable growth that comes from building trust and loyalty. Things that can't be bought, only earned." The boardroom fell quiet once again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was clear that there was still hesitation in the room, but for the first time, Julia felt like they were listening. This wasn't just about policies on paper, it was about a shift in mindset, and she could see that the members were starting to realize the long-term potential of this change. Caroline Winters, who had been largely silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "I've seen the internal changes with my own eyes. The employees are starting to believe in the mission. There's a sense of pride in the company that wasn't there before, and we can't ignore that. It's affecting everything, from how our flight attendants interact with passengers, to how our management makes decisions. If we don't support this, if we don't stand behind these changes, we risk losing everything we've worked for, and Skyline will become just another airline." Her words struck a chord with the others. Caroline, once an advocate for maintaining the old systems, had fully embraced the company's new direction. Her support was critical, and it seemed that the board was finally recognizing how much had changed, how much was at stake. Julia took a deep breath, the momentum now on her side. She had done everything she could to prove that the company's future depended on these changes. But this wasn't just about her vision, it was about the collective effort, the unity that was slowly starting to form within Skyline's leadership. Finally, Richard Lee, one of the senior board members who had been quiet up until this point, cleared his throat. "I think we're all getting the picture here," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Skyline needs to evolve. We've been caught in the past trying to maintain a brand of exclusivity when, frankly, the world has moved beyond that. I think it's time we take a leap forward. We'll stand behind this." Julia felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered with the understanding that the work had only just begun. The board wasn't just approving a series of policies. They were endorsing a vision, a way forward that would reshape Skyline's identity in the eyes of the world. Alexander gave her a quick glance, the slightest nod of approval. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the quiet acknowledgement that the direction they had set was now the future of Skyline. The vote came quickly. One by one, the board members voiced their support, and by the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. Skyline would fully embrace its new path, a path toward respect, inclusion, and equality for all passengers. Julia allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. The road ahead would still be challenging. There would be more hurdles, more resistance, but for now, they had won the most important battle. As the meeting ended and the board members began to leave, Alexander turned to Julia. "We did it," he said quietly, the weight of the moment sinking in. Julia smiled, but it was a smile tinged with the recognition that this was just the beginning. "We did. But now the real work starts. We've got a long way to go, but I know we can do it." Together, they stood in the conference room, surrounded by the remnants of the meeting. The future of Skyline was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Julia felt a sense of hope. They had set the course. They had laid the foundation for a new kind of airline, one that stood for something more than just profits, one that would change the industry forever.